John Greenewald. Saw him first at the Bay Area UFO Expo a couple years ago. Not only was I blown away by his talk, but he's one of the youngest people doing this since the age of 15. On his website, he's requested Freedom of Information Act documents, and he's been posting them for years. He gets 250,000 hits a month on his website easily now. And what you're going to see are authentic government documents that are available to you and me. John's navigated the red tape to make them available. Of course, you'll only see about 10% of most of them because they're blacked out, what they finally released to the public. But this is official government records of UFOs, files from John's website, which is theblackvault.com. Glad to have you, John.
Good morning. It is true for the past almost 8 years, it'll be 8 years in August, I've been researching this phenomenon. And good morning. Is that? I got to turn it on. Is that better? Yes. Okay. Good morning. For the last 8 years, I have been researching this UFO phenomenon and related conspiracies within the U.S. government using a tool called the Freedom of Information Act. Now, Guy gave you a little background on me, but a little bit more. I started this when I was 15 years old. I just did a lecture, or I'm sorry, I didn't do a lecture, but I was helping out at the X conference, filming a TV series that we're working on, where I had celebrated also my 23rd birthday this year. So as I was starting this at 15, the government didn't quite take me too seriously. They thought I was just a student looking for a couple things on UFOs and that I would give up. Little did they know that 8 years later I would still be at it. I filed almost 2,000 requests to almost every corner of the government. I've learned of government agencies I never even heard about. I've learned about their offices and their sub-offices, and they forward you to addresses that don't even exist. And I mean, it's a tough game to play. But 8 years later, I'm still at it and created this website that receives about 250,000 people a month. The hit count on the server is breaking records every month consecutively. Which I'll get into the numbers in a little bit. So, also when I started this, they never thought that I would reach 139,577 pages of scanned government documents on this website called the Black Vault. What I wanted to do, what I wanted to accomplish, was to get this information out for people like you and me to try and find what the government was really hiding. When you look online, especially 8 years ago, there was no site that actually had documents on it about the UFO phenomenon, about anything. And I mean, I searched for hours, searched for days, for looking for a site very much like mine is programmed today, and it didn't exist. The government itself didn't even really have a scanned database at all. I don't know if I played a role in that. They started about 1.5 years to 2 years after I did. And then they started releasing information online. From the Defense Intelligence Agency alone, I received, I don't know the exact count, but there's about 300 pages of information. I counted the numbers that I got from the Defense Intelligence Agency 2 years prior to them putting it online. They're 40 pages short. They decided to take out a couple pages, so when you would log on to the Defense Intelligence Agency site and you look at all UFO documents, you think that that's everything. Why? Because they tell you that's everything. Unfortunately, they left about 39 pages out. So what they're doing is they're orchestrating this lie, I guess you could say. And I know that comes as a big surprise and shock to some of you. But they're trying to lead you to believe something that is not necessarily true, one of which is, here's our UFO documentation. Don't bother to try and research it. However, they're short. And that goes on to other agencies as well. So what is this Freedom of Information Act that I use? The act and the process is fairly simple, surprisingly. You create a letter, you cite the Freedom of Information Act, you say what kind of requester you are. The categories are commercial, non-commercial, academic, news media. And that kind of determines how much you're going to pay. I'm luckily non-commercial, and you'll find out later the CIA and the Department of Defense says differently, and they have no grounds for it. And I've been fighting this one for years. But this entitles you to access, this act entitles you to access these government documents. Now again, the process is very simple, but the trick is to learn exactly how the US government is going to deal with you and the subject matter that you're requesting. Now I've dealt with nuclear weapons, biological weapons, the UFO phenomenon, top secret military tests, nuclear missile mishaps, nuclear weapons accidents. You hear definitions of like broken arrow and bent spear. You don't even want to know why they've developed definitions for these words, but they have accidents. Nuclear warheads on planes that they crash. There's a lost nuclear weapon off the coast of Georgia that's still there to this day, 30, 40 years after they jettisoned it out into the ocean, and it's still there. So you start the ability to start accessing all this information, and this is what the Freedom of Information Act entitles you to. The only problem is the U.S. government plays all these games. Like I said, they forward you to offices that don't exist. The letter comes back, and they say, sorry, this address is no longer valid. You try and get them to answer why they gave you that address, and they just shun you anyway. The Freedom of Information Act doesn't require them to answer questions. So when you ask them, hey, why'd you do this? They don't have to answer you. All they have to do is give you documentation. Now, it seems like a very difficult process, and it sounds like a difficult process that doesn't work. I'm here to tell you that it does. Even post-September 11th, as many probably read or heard about an article that was done by the San Francisco Chronicle trying to say that John Ashcroft put out a memo, Freedom of Information Act didn't apply anymore. Honestly, that was pretty false. I talked to that reporter online, and she didn't care for me too much questioning where she got her source, because I read that memo. And I even called the Department of Defense on the telephone and asked them outright. And they said that they had no idea what the Ashcroft memo was. And on top of that, the policy didn't change. And if it did, it wouldn't come from John Ashcroft's office. So that completely dismissed the article. And that's when I had called the reporter. And she wasn't too excited to hear from me, because I tried to dismiss what she was saying. So you'll see that the Freedom of Information Act works. It just involves something that not many of us have, me included, and that's patience. I've had to learn and teach myself how to deal with waiting, not a month, not 6 months, not even a year, but you'll see later on 22,000 pages of CIA documents that I got that I fought for 6.5 years. So that's a little bit of what they do to you, is make you wait. And that's another game, and I call it the waiting game. So after I started building the site, the Black Vault started to grow. And Whitley Strieber, if you remember his book Confirmation, which was later made into a TV show, a 2-hour documentary on NBC, that was my first break. That was really what put the Black Vault on the internet map, so to speak. And I did 6.7 million people that tried to access the site in 24 hours. Now, if the government tries to tell you there's no interest in this subject, that's perfect proof right there, that 6.7 million people worldwide on that day tried to get into my site and couldn't. Only about 500,000 people could actually surf around because it just absolutely killed the server. Now, since then, it tapered off. But years later, I kept breaking hits, and I started realizing that this site was valuable. People were using this as a research tool. In March of 2004, I did 10 million hits. Now, how many exact people this is, it's hard to tell. Servers are weird when they count. I base it on hits on the server because that shows how much people are downloading, how much they're visiting. And April was my biggest month, or so I thought, 14.5 million hits. Then in May, I broke just under 19 million hits for just 1 month. So it was growing. And as you can see, it was almost doubling in 60 days. 26,000 users have registered worldwide, and that's on a volunteer basis. You don't have to register, you don't have to pay, nothing to go to the site. Again, there's a lot of interest in the subject. Now, for us computer geeks like myself, 55 gigabytes of data was downloaded. That's 5,500 megabytes, roughly, that was downloaded from my site. That's a few thousand little floppy disks that people were pulling from my site every month. That's how much data is going out, and every month it keeps rising. So let's talk about Project Blue Book. When you first dive into the UFO phenomenon, you have to get a little bit of background. You have to get a background of what did they do? What was their involvement with this phenomenon? Project Blue Book was pretty much where you're going to start. We all know the stories behind Blue Book. Started in '47, ended in 1969 or so, they claim. And its main goal was to research this phenomenon that everybody was seeing. This Roswell incident fittingly that we're here, created this buzz that everybody just started seeing UFO sightings around the nation. If you look at the statistics, it was really, really small through to 1947, and all of a sudden 47 hit, and it was this huge jump in sightings. And if you look on a bar graph, it's very interesting to see how many sightings were around these years. And then all the sci-fi flicks started to come, and people got worried, so the U.S. government said, okay, well, we got to figure out what this phenomenon is, calm everybody down. I wrote an article when I was 17 that was published around called Project Blue Book, an investigation or a explanation. I kind of felt that Project Blue Book was used to explain, not necessarily investigate, the UFO phenomenon. And others who have really delved into the Project Blue Book history, it really says the same thing, is that a lot of the more important UFO sightings were funneled to different agencies, never getting under the heading of Project Blue Book, and they were researched elsewhere. Now, I didn't spend a whole lot of time on Project Blue Book. And the reason being is I would have spent thousands of dollars for the records, because the government never told me that it was archived on microfilm. They never told me that. They said I would have to pay $1/4 a page, and there was roughly 33,000 pages that I would have to buy. Now, who in this world is going to pay almost $9,000 or whatever the amount is for these Project Blue Book records? I mean, I knew they were pretty boring anyway, and I knew they were probably out there in the UFO community. Now, these were the statistics that they put out on a U.S. government-sponsored fact sheet. And I always put in quotes this fact sheet because, honestly, there's not one fact on it. The only thing that really was true about it were these points here. They investigated 12,618 sightings in total. Out of those, 701 remained unidentified. Now, the reason they remained unidentified was simple. There was just a lack of facts or lack of evidence, so the government said, they were probably easily explained anyway. All UFO investigations were stopped, so this fact sheet started to tell you. This was the best statement of all. No government agency has ever taken an interest in UFOs since then. Now, I focus on this fact sheet for one reason and one reason only. You can prove the conspiracy or the cover-up or whatever you want to call it behind the UFO phenomenon with just this one page of a fact sheet that the U.S. government put out. I've received it from NASA, the NSA, the CIA, the Pentagon, the Air Force. You name it, they all have a version of this fact sheet, just slightly worded because they reworded it throughout the years, or depending upon the agency, they might have a different letterhead. But it's all the same. And they give you these statistics. And the first two are pretty much the only ones that are true on it. Everything else was false. But remember this statement: no government agency has ever taken an interest since then. One agency actually went to the trouble to highlight no other government agency. So they really wanted to stress to you and me that no one in the U.S. government takes this seriously. It was dismissed in 1969, said, you know what, we've done this for way too long, and there's nothing to it. It later tells you if you do see a UFO to go to your local law enforcement, and that's it. So remember this, because my entire lecture is going to be based on this fact sheet, and you can answer at the end whether or not this is actually a true statement. To name a few, the CIA, the FBI, National Security Agency, Defense Intelligence Agency, Department of Defense, Department of the Army, Department of the Navy, Department of the Air Force, you name the agency, they almost all had UFO documents to actually be uncovered. All available under the Freedom of Information Act. But on top of that, they didn't end in 1969 like the government wanted to tell you. And on top of that, it also proved that the fact sheet telling you all UFO documents, and they say all UFO documents, including those of which were in Project Blue Book, were in the possession of the National Archives, our nation's library. Now remember, it was the National Archives that told me 25 cents a page. I'm glad they did, because that deterred me from them and made me start researching other agencies. So in a way, I have to thank them for being so hard on me and for being so difficult, because that then made me go to these other agencies, and I discovered the lie that they were telling me, that these documents were in fact strewn all over the government from all different years. In fact, these two right here were just in the last 5 to 10 years. Okay, now you're dealing with something that's incredibly top secret here. Okay, these don't exist. So what I'm showing you, it's your imagination. You know, come on. I've got hundreds of pages that look just like this that come from the Defense Intelligence Agency under the Freedom of Information Act. Everybody sitting in this room, no matter what country you're from, no matter what state you're from, no matter your age, anything, you can request these documents. It's real easy. Here's a couple more. But the Defense Intelligence Agency, the one that released these, you can see, I don't know if you can see up there, the date is 1990 on some of these. There's some that are from 95, 96. You know, this is still an active phenomenon. This is still something that the government takes seriously. This is still something that they document. This is still something that they consider highly top secret. But don't fret, because they saved our tax dollars. They didn't use as much ink as you might think. Because they black out so much, you can see that they just simply cut out pieces of paper and tape pieces of paper on these things. That's not ink. They're pretty straight lines on the end, so they just cut out big pieces of paper and photocopied that. So honestly, this pretty much shows you exactly what you're dealing with and how the government views you. So I started with it's X-Files. It's like an agent in there. I thought it was X-Files, but anyone say anything. So that was one of the first agencies that I dealt with, was the Defense Intelligence Agency. Hundreds of pages look like the 4 that I just showed you. And that in itself can prove the conspiracy, but it doesn't end there. I figured, where else should I go? Space Command, which was headquartered at Peterson Air Force Base, under the control of the United States Air Force. I figured it would be a cool place to start. I mean, you know, they monitor any incoming ICBMs. I figure if there's UFOs out there, they might see them. And I did a request for all UFO documents. And I got a couple boring ones that were called in from civilians. And honestly, it doesn't mean that they're not true. I just didn't pay attention to them. But one of them on the tower log on 16 May of 1996 said this: received call of UFO sighting at Griffith Air Force Base, New York. 4 enlisted men observed circular orange lights just above tree line east-southeast of their location. 5 minutes total hovered and then disappeared. So I used this as a basis of another FOIA request that I sent to Griffith Air Force Base. I wanted to find out, okay, if these 4 enlisted men saw this, there's documentation at Griffith Air Force Base that will probably authenticate this. Griffith Air Force Base said, well, the documents you're looking for aren't at this office. They're at this one here, which happened to be on the same base, just a different address. That was strange. Usually they'll forward it for you. The government will forward it for you. I said, wow, that's weird. So, you know, they could pretty much just walked over probably 4 offices over and handed the request to them. They didn't do it. They made me send another request, which I did. And about 10 days later, I got I'm sorry, the address does not exist. So I called the other office, and they said, we'll call you back. I'm still waiting for the phone call back. I wrote them a letter, and sure enough, I'm still waiting for the correct address. So these are the games that they play. I had to let that one go, and that mystery is just going to kind of remain in the Black Vault archives, so to speak. Now, how are they reporting these things? I figured, you know, okay, so they're reporting these UFOs. Project Blue Book is no longer in effect. How are they getting these things out there? Now, JANAP 146E is something that's been around the UFO community for a long time. And you know, one thing, and I always talk about this, one thing when you work with the U.S. government is you got to learn a heck of a lot of acronyms. And they have like an encyclopedia of just the Department of Defense's list of acronyms is about 550 to 600 pages long. Just acronyms. You know, so you're dealing with some very confusing stuff when you try and read a document that's 50% acronyms, you know, and it gets a little ridiculous. But this particular one stands for Joint Army Navy Air Force Publication. Okay, and this showed how to report UFOs, when to report them. I believe it came into existence in '66, so this was during the time of Project Blue Book. Now, when '69 came around, the U.S. Air Force said, well, we're not going to collect these things anymore. And you go ahead and you know, stop collecting these reports. But JANAP 146 still was around, and it wasn't modified until 1977. The only problem is, in it was unidentified flying objects. This was the list on what to report in this. Missiles, hostile and unidentified submarines, hostile and unidentified groups of military, and unidentified flying objects. So in 1977, they still wanted these UFOs to be reported. Also in this list, but I don't have it in the presentation here, is unidentified military aircraft, another type of aircraft. What the government terms as a UFO in this publication, we don't know. They won't define it. They won't tell you what they think it is. It's just a UFO. Space-based objects were in this or a similar publication, which were obviously funneled to NASA. And this is the clip that's straight from, oops. Well, that was the excerpt that was straight from JANAP 146. So where are they sending these reports to? That was my next step. I had to figure out, okay, well, you guys are looking into these UFOs. You're reporting them under JANAP 146E. You got to be sending them somewhere. And that somewhere was NORAD, headquartered at Peterson Air Force Base, ironically at the same place that I found the tarot log at Space Command. Well, when I did a Freedom of Information Act request to NORAD for all of these what are called service reports, it's another acronym for you, Communication Instructions for Reporting Vital Intelligence Sightings. These service reports, filed under JANAP 146E, see there's a lot of acronyms to learn, were funneled to NORAD. This is NORAD's response to my letter. NORAD is a binational command established by Volume 33 United States Treaties, page 1277, subject to control of both Canadian and U.S. government agencies as defined in the Act, and is consequently not subject to the U.S. Freedom of Information Act. How convenient is that? They're sending these UFO records that obviously don't exist to an agency that's not subject to the Freedom of Information Act, which is one of two that I know of. You can't send a FOIA request to the White House, and you can't send one to NORAD, apparently. Now, they later say that they're going to do this in good faith, that they're going to process it under a NORAD's processing regulation, very much like the Freedom of Information Act, but it's their own wording, so really it didn't even mean much. And they said that we found no records pertaining to your request. Well, that was kind of strange. This JANAP 146E, which I believe is still on the books, no service reports were ever reported in 30 years, or however, we're approaching 40. So I thought that was kind of strange. And this was one of the biggest discoveries that I made in 8 years, and it took me a year to realize, and I kick myself every time I talk about it, because the answer that I needed to get these documents was listed right, or mentioned right in the letter from NORAD. And it's the part that says, subject to control of both Canadian and U.S. government agencies. So I thought, well, wait a minute here. Let's just pretend for a minute that Canada had something. Since the NORAD installation was under control of Canada, maybe they have a Freedom of Information Act also. Maybe they have a way I can access records, request reports, request whatever it may be. And sure enough, they do. It's called the Access to Information Act. Now, I didn't want to mess with postal mail because I got pretty excited. I wanted to find these UFO records. I had never seen them before. So I called them. I called the Department of National Defense, spelled with a C on purpose, which is their equivalent to our Department of Defense. So I called them on the telephone, and I said, hello, my name is I just said John, and I'm calling in regards to the Access of Information Act. Can a U.S. citizen use this act? Well, I guess if the records have been released before, I don't see why not. So, okay, great. So I'll tell you what I'm looking for. I said, I'm looking for these reports that are called service reports that deal with unidentified flying, and he interrupted me in mid-sentence. He said, oh, yeah, I have them right here. And I said, now remember, I only said my name was John, and he didn't know why I was calling. And I said, what? I'm sorry? He says, yeah, I like to keep these things handy. They're right here on my desk. And I said, okay. I said, what do you got? And he says, and they're all the UFO records at the Department of National Defense. And I said, okay. I said, well, can I get them? I was like kind of floored, and I didn't ask him, why do you keep these things handy? And I should have. And he hasn't returned my call when I called him after to ask why. But I said, how can I get these things? Can I get a copy of them? And he says, yeah, well, you got a visa? And I said, yeah, sure, I don't leave home without it. And I pulled it out. It was the best $3 that he charged me for these records on my visa. It was probably more expensive for them to process the batch versus just sending me the documents. Sure enough, I pulled it out, gave it to him on the telephone, and as he's processing the receipt or whatever, I said, well, just out of curiosity, what are the years? And he thumbs through. I can hear him thumb through, and he says, let's see, 2000 or 1999 to December or October of last year. And when he said last year, that was like 2001 or 2002. And I said, really? Okay, great, perfect. So and there were about 100 pages or so. I asked him that too. And he said, sure, so, have fun. And I said, thanks. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, they came in the mail, and I opened them up, and I'm going through them, and pretty boring. I won't lie. I mean, they were fairly boring, but they were all UFO sightings, from saucer-shaped to cigar-shaped, termed very much just like that. It said cigar-shaped UFO. And one sighting described very much like the Phoenix lights, a flying triangle, lights, multiple lights, flying in a V formation. It wasn't the Phoenix lights incident, but that's exactly what it was describing. And I was like, oh, wow, this is great, because this proves what NORAD said was wrong. They said, well, we don't collect these things, we don't have any documents. Well, this is proof that these documents had to be channeled through NORAD at some time. So when they said since 1969 we haven't collected anything, which is in like 5 signed NORAD letters with their letterhead that they have sent to me, they're lying. Why? There's nothing to this phenomenon. Remember, the investigation stopped in 1969 and there's nothing to it. Why are they still collecting these things? And sure enough, the Canadian government was the one that actually helped me out in uncovering that. But anybody that knows me personally knows that that's not enough, and that wasn't enough. In that batch that they sent me of the service reports came a cover page and 1 page from the Canadian equivalent to our FAA of a manual on how to report UFO sightings for commercial pilots. So that sparked an idea in my head, okay, well maybe our own FAA has something like that. So I hopped onto the internet, and anybody can do this. If you go to FAA.gov, the FAA's official website, it's all government run, search the keyword, I haven't done this in a few months, but search the keyword database for CIRVIS, you know, those UFO reports that we all want. And sure enough, you get a hit, but only one. Don't get it, it's their own acronym list. But this told me something. Okay, some publication in the FAA's holdings has service in it. And it wasn't online, surprisingly. So I did some searching, a few hours of it, that lasted quite some time, actually. It was more than a few hours. And a couple weeks later, I discovered FAA Manual 7110.10N Flight Services. In Chapter 6, Section 5, Subsection 6, Paragraph D, it gets confusing, listed JANAP 146E, Canadian United States Communications Instructions for Reporting Vital Intelligence Sightings, is an unclassified, non-registered publication prepared by U.S. Military Communications Electronics Board in conjunction with Canada for joint U.S. and Canadian use. It showed that the commercial pilots themselves were instructed to report these UFO sightings. How? They used the JANAP 146E publication as a way to do it, as a guideline. So now this was bingo for me, because the date of this publication was 2002. So then it was revised again in March of 2003. Also, JANAP 146E, how to report UFOs, was still in it. So commercial aviation pilots are also seeing these unidentified flying objects. Now, does it sound plausible that in 40 years, no commercial pilot has seen anything to report? Absolutely not. Where do you think they send them to? NORAD. Can we touch them? No, because they don't exist. So this was starting to paint a picture to me that I was at least on to something. Now again, if you know me personally, that wasn't enough. I had to have a military connection. And sure enough, it came. I searched ALTAVISTA. It was before I discovered Google, for us computer guys. But I searched ALTAVISTA. And I searched for CIRVIS. And sure enough, you come up with hits for JANAP 146E, QFON, Computer UFO Network. Has it on their site, so you get that hit, and a couple other things that might mention these service reports. But nothing big. And then all of a sudden, result number 20. And I printed it out because sure enough, it did disappear from the ALTAVISTA database. But the actual manual it referenced is real, so anybody can get that. But I printed it out, and it was headed Air Force Instruction 10-206, Table of Contents. Now this was hit by the keyword service, so I knew Air Force Instruction 10-206 was something I wanted. So I clicked on it, and sure enough, it didn't exist. So Google, or ALTAVISTA, working very much like Google, at least archived it, but I couldn't access it. So I thought, okay, so I filed a Freedom of Information Act request for this Air Force instruction, paid $25, and got it. It had nothing to do with service. And then I realized something. On the top corner, they didn't send me Air Force Instruction 10-206. They sent Air Intelligence Agency, which is AIA Instruction 10-206. Completely different publication. They tried to throw me off, and it didn't work. For some reason, ALTAVISTA said Air Force instruction. It's actually Air Force manual. It took a little bit of searching. Air Force Manual 10-206 was exactly what I wanted. Chapter 5, the heading, Communications Instructions for Reporting Vital Intelligence Sightings, or better known as SIRVIs. Where do you think they submitted these to? Now, we're not dealing with commercial pilots anymore. We're not dealing with the Canadian government, and we're not dealing with anything other than our very own United States Air Force, the one of which said, we don't investigate these UFOs anymore. Yeah, here's a manual devoted to exactly just that, listed UFOs in it. Now, there's no more mention of JANAP 146E. Why? Because the US Air Force has their own manual for it, also listing UFOs, worded pretty much the same. But now you're not dealing with a joint publication anymore that the US government could say, oh, well, you know what, the Canadian government kept it in. No, this is a pure United States Air Force manual that specifically mentions these UFO sightings. And sure enough, they want these sent to the Commander-in-Chief, to the North American Aerospace Defense Command, also known as NORAD. So what was the date, do you think, of this Air Force manual when it was last updated? And that was just in the last 12 months. And yet again, Chapter 5 is still devoted to these service reports. So this was big for me. This proved beyond any shadow of a doubt. No one can dispute that the United States Air Force is absolutely involved with unidentified flying objects. This here is the actual excerpt from the publication. As you can see, the first line, hostile or unidentified aircraft. Any Earth-based explanation for what a UFO is, whether it be an unidentified military aircraft, a missile, and it goes on to some other stuff, it's all defined. What does the US Air Force itself consider an unidentified flying object? And that question still remains. So yet again, it wasn't enough. And I started researching not only the US Air Force as a whole, but I started researching the actual flight manuals for certain aircraft. And sure enough, the pilots were individually instructed to report UFO sightings. You can see the C-130 aircraft crews were. The F-117, that plane that others try and say we might see when we see a UFO, the stealth fighter, they're instructed to report UFOs. The C-12 aircraft, they're instructed. Yet it keeps going. In fact, it goes on and on and on. KC-10, KC-135, F-16s, F-15s, the C-137, the C-5, the C-21, the C-212, the B-52, the B-2, the B-1, and I could keep going. What does this prove? Not only is the Air Force fully instructed to report these UFOs, but so are the pilots, the crew members, and anybody flying in present day, military conflicts, training missions, you name it. They're probably seeing these things all funneled to an agency that's not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. Now, who now can argue that this phenomenon is not real? Does it prove that they're alien visitors? Maybe not. But it proves that the government is so adamantly trying to convince you that the UFO phenomenon is not real. Why? Like I told you in the beginning, I've dealt with subjects that go beyond any boundary of conspiracy. You know, I mean, these things are scary. Nuclear weapons, biological tests on humans, with and without their knowledge. You know, the CIA, which I'll talk about at the very end, the CIA accidentally, quote unquote, killing one of their very own agents in the MK Ultra experiments. UFO phenomenon, or the UFO subject, is still the #1 hardest subject for me to research. And you have to ask the question of why. If this is so easily explained, why then am I dealing with agencies that don't want to help? Agencies that try and lie to each and every one of us saying this phenomenon is not real. Somebody has to ask that question. The Central Intelligence Agency itself had quite a bit of records to be discovered. The only problem was they denied UFO records from the date of 1979 on. The history behind this was simple. There was a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit that was brought around in 1979 to fight for the UFO records that the CIA was holding as top secret or classified. Now, this process comes after you file a Freedom of Information Act request. if you file a request and you are denied, and if you're denied for it's classified, or if you're denied because there's no records, if you have grounds to appeal that decision, you can appeal. You file what's called an administrative appeal. You send that to the agency. They send it to the legal lawyers. You do the waiting game again. And sure enough, they're either going to grant you or deny you yet again. If they deny you again, you can take them to court legally. That's something I haven't done. I want to, but I haven't done it yet because I'm going to wait for the big one, for something that is worthwhile to take them to court over and really try and put the money into getting some of these documents out. But in 1979, one agency did. They took the CIA to court, fought for these UFO records, and about 992, if I remember correctly, were declassified and released. Well, ever since then, the CIA said, okay, if any UFO nut's going to come along and request these things, we're going to sell them. And we're going to sell them for $140, and we're going to make sure that they just buy this batch, and that's it. They didn't tell you something. It only went to 1979. So when I started my search in 97, and it was a few-year battle with the CIA of trying to get the records from 1979 on declassified, they denied it, and they denied it, and they denied it over and over and over. And they said, no, these records pay $140. They weren't even referencing the ones after 1979. They weren't even trying to help. I said, I'm not interested in those. Those have been out. Those have been written about. Those are in books. I want the stuff that you guys haven't even acknowledged yet. They wouldn't do it. It wasn't even that they were denying me. They weren't even referencing that part of my request. They were just going to say, they were giving me a bill pretty much for $140. So it literally took about 3 years of battling with letters from the CIA back and forth. Phone calls didn't help. And finally, they said, we've done a review of the records from 79 on and have compiled everything into one package. And it's now for sale for not $140 like I would have paid, but over $300 because they declassified over 2,000 pages of newly released UFO records. Now, if you know me personally, my eyes lit up, and I was like, this is perfect. 2,000 pages had never been seen before. So I paid it. I paid like the $300-some-odd for these UFO records, and they came in 2 boxes. Albeit it was a couple months before I got them, but they came in 2 boxes. One of which was the 990-plus pages of material that was released before. By chance, that's the first box that I opened. Thumbed through it, seen a lot of the documents before. There was even a CIA UFO CD-ROM that was published years and years ago of these records. But I knew that second box was the 2,000 pages of newly released documents. So I frantically opened that up, and my mom can account for this. I just sat on the floor Indian style with all these documents in front of me, and she just kind of laughed and shook her head. And I pulled all these records out and slammed them on the floor, and I started researching them, or looking through them and doing research, and I realized that each and every last one was a newspaper article. I fought for years. I paid hundreds of dollars for newspaper articles. Now, can anybody tell me why the CIA is classifying and trying to heavily hide newspaper articles? No one can really say why. Each and every last one of them. Now, that first batch in 1979 was all that cool stuff that I showed you in the beginning, blacked out information, photocopies of like the onion skin paper, and people think I'm weird when I say government documents even smell different, but they do. And this stuff was just spit out newspaper articles from one of their databases. And I was very frustrated. And I started to think to myself, what seems more plausible, that this was a cover-up to shut me up, to just say, God, Greenewald's at it again. They do know I know this from firsthand accounts. They know my name very well. And that's not paranoia talking. That's not anything. I called the CIA director for the Freedom of Information Act. And I said, hello. His name was Lee Strickland. And I asked for Mr. Strickland on the phone and said my name was John Greenewald. I was calling him. He's like, yeah, I know who you are. He said it just like that. He interrupted me. He said, yeah, I know who you are. And I kind of freaked out, because here's the CIA telling me on the phone, yeah, I know who you are. So I just like, oh, okay, and he was a nice guy, professional and pretty straightforward. But these guys, they knew my name. So, was it plausible that they just sent me these things because they knew I would not go away? For near 1,000 days, I was going, full steam ahead, trying to get these documents. Now they sent me all these newspaper articles, and that was trying to convince me, hey, wait a minute, we're very open with our archive, and we sent you everything. Then you got to ask yourself, did that court case come the exact time frame that the CIA switched to just collecting UFO reports versus these other sightings and other intelligence reports? And that doesn't sound plausible to me. Needless to say, I felt that there was more stuff, but sure enough, I'll never be able to access it. Now, as I'm thumbing through, there were a couple that were kind of cool. These are documents that did come in that 2,000-page pile of junk, pretty much. But one of these headlines came from Moscow, and the headline read, "UFO reportedly lands in mountain pass near Yerevan." Now, it's just kind of interesting, though, regardless of them being pretty boring UFO newspaper clippings, pretty much, that they were still taking such a great interest in this phenomenon years after they said that they didn't care about it. Why would they care? This is like a tabloidish article that a UFO landed on Earth that happened in August of 1991. Why did they care about that? Or this one, object seen floating around the mirror. This one was kind of interesting, actually. A cosmonaut was filming outside the window of the mirror, and all of a sudden a UFO came from underneath, pretty much like underneath the window, or the view of the window, as to say, hey, hello, and just zipped off. And that's exactly what the newspaper article talked about. For those that might be around the LA area, it was a local station, KCAL9, did a story, and they profiled this headline because they themselves felt it was newsworthy. That, we didn't hear about this UFO that was seen out of the mirror, but the CIA sure took it very, very seriously and actually archived and translated the documents. Now all these are in foreign languages. So on this phenomenon that we all know may or may not be real, they're paying those tax dollars to translate these foreign documents. They're paying the tax dollars, our tax dollars, to house the documents, all on a phenomenon that's a figment of all of our imaginations. And you have to ask that question, why? This conspiracy, it sounds very plausible that they know that this is real. And you have to put all these facts together like a puzzle. And I've always said the analogy of, you put these pieces together like a puzzle, and you put them together and they make a pretty big picture. But when you do this, especially for 8 years, you realize that once you get that picture together and you think, wow, I did something, that picture is just a piece to an even bigger puzzle. And it keeps going out and farther and out and farther, and it gets a little frustrating sometimes. And that's that thing that I had to teach myself, the P word that I always hate to use with the government, called patience, as I had to really learn to deal with the government, fill in the blank, that I had to deal with. How do you do that? And really there's one word that I would stress to all of you when you yourself might look at these documents, is you have to learn the patience to deal with them. The National Security Agency pretty much had a similar story. A lawsuit was brought around about the same time, trying to get these documents out. The NSA said that they were classified. The story then was a little bit different. The judge that was presiding over the case was given what's called an in-camera top-secret clearance. This was a clearance that he was given simply to look at a 21-page top-secret affidavit that was created by the NSA on why UFO information was classified. Now, the judge read this, and the NSA created a public affidavit that wasn't as fun, that was tried to explain to you and me why the information was classified. But the judge got the real one, the cool one. And it really defined why the NSA felt that the UFO phenomenon / these UFO documents were classified. And sure enough, the NSA won their case. The judge said, absolutely, these things should be classified and remain hidden from the public. Now, again, that's a big fat question mark, but you can't go farther than a lawsuit. Once you lose that, that's it. Now, years later, they had declassified, or so to speak, the top secret affidavit. Now, Stanton Friedman has these. You might see him hold these up a lot as well. This is the government's explanation for why UFOs are not real. Now, these are heavily blacked out, obviously. Even to this day, the UFO phenomenon is extremely classified. And their explanation itself is still incredibly classified. Years after this was released, they released one more batch of documents. These were the UFO documents that for years UFO researchers, including myself, tried to get declassified. Now, this was probably about, if I remember correctly, 400 pages or so. And these were all the records, in addition to the ones that the NSA had already released, that they felt for all these years were classified, and they finally declassified them. However, there was one problem. They blacked out almost 100% of everything on the page. You'll see that, other than the stupid routing codes at the top that are really pointless and mean nothing, final section of 3. That's all you see. That's it. Now, what value is there in that? When I cropped this image, it took me a while to realize that when you look at the full pages, they actually used whiteout instead of blackout in addition to the blackout. So when you look at the documents up close, you can see the same thing. It's really kind of ridiculous exactly how they did this. But sure enough, some of them are readable, but really it meant nothing. They should have just kept them classified. But they tried to do this while we're opening our archive to you. And it was just reinforcing our case that even these UFO records that were 10 years old, 15 years old, or even 5 years old were still 100% in some cases classified. And that's a pretty big question mark when you ask me in trying to uncover this phenomenon. Another game that they play is a real fun one. When they tell you something that isn't true. And this example came from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. When I did a request way back in '97 to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, I requested all documents on UFOs, Project Blue Book, Project Sign, Project Grudge, which was Blue Book's pre-names. And I tried to find out what their holdings contained. And they told me this installation is not the release authority for the documents you have requested. As you can tell by the attached fact sheet, all documents pertaining to Project Blue Book or UFOs are now in the possession of the National Archives and Records Service. For information pertaining to Project Blue Book or UFOs, please contact the National Archives and Records Service at the address highlighted in the attached fact sheet. This is the exact listing, or the exact letter that they sent me. When they bolded it, it was, that's what they said. Now look on the last line. They even put fact sheet in quotes, and I thought that was very fitting, because I think they themselves know that that is not a fact sheet at all. Here's the problem. About 6 months goes by, I picked up a magazine of UFO. I was picking up a UFO magazine at the time. I wrote a column for them. And they had a small blurb article at the corner of it saying that Wright-Patterson Air Force Base released 1,000 pages of UFO documents. I said, well, wait a minute. I read it, and sure enough, the release authority, or the person that was involved in releasing these things, was the same guy that signed this letter. It was T. Sargent. I think he's been promoted since then. That's always fun, too, when I deal with people that I watch their promotions. But it was T. Sargent Husselman. And Husselman was the one that actually released these records. And I was like, wait, so I wrote an article or a letter to the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Well, wait a minute, guys. I did a request for you. You said you did an exhaustive search. You found nothing. Project Blue Book and UFO documents were all in the possession of the archives. Yeah, here you are releasing 1,000 pages. What gives? They wrote me back and they said, please remit your check for $175 or whatever it is, and we'll give you the package. They didn't answer my question. I said, you got to be kidding me. I tried to get them to answer it, but sure enough, I whipped out my checkbook and bought the documents, and probably the worst $140 I ever spent, because it was, it was boring. To me, I'm not saying and to everyone, to me it was just boring stuff that we have all heard. The only difference was we have not seen these 1,000 pages before. I think the bigger picture was what I found more valuable. That the U.S. government, no matter what agency you're dealing with, no matter what person you're dealing with, no matter what rank you're dealing with, they're going to tell you one thing. And you have to take the word that it's true. You have to. You have no choice. Should I have appealed that? Well, what are my grounds? This is one of those really tough things. And that's why in the beginning of the presentation I had Freedom of Information Act, or Freedom of Information with a question mark. Because you really do not know what they're telling you is true or not true. But with dealing with just what they do tell you, you know they cover stuff up, you know they lie to you, you know they're doing this. If you just deal with what they tell you, and just in the back of your head dismiss everything else, you can prove the conspiracy, you can prove the cover-up. There's no doubt. And that's just what they tell you. Now think about what they don't tell you. So pictures start to become more clear. They start to become more believable when you start dealing with the subject matter of the UFO phenomenon and you see what they're open with. It's kind of scary to think about what they're probably hiding. Now, I was going to take this part out, and I'll kind of skim through it a little bit faster than what I do, but I decided fittingly, this is the first lecture I've ever done in Roswell, so I thought I had to talk about Roswell. But it's one that I haven't really delved into that much. When the Black Vault was growing and I started to receive a bunch of letters, they the majority of them said, well, what about the Roswell incident? You know, because that's what a lot of us know the most. That's the stuff we hear about on TV. You know, we hear about the festivals. We hear about all the, you know, the R word is what we really become comfortable with. The media uses it a lot. Television shows use it a lot. I mean, that's kind of what's branded into this UFO community is the Roswell incident. Well, what I wanted to do was find out what the government had on the Roswell incident. Why not? You know, it's a couple bucks worth of stamps and a couple of hours of work of, you know, going every which direction. And sure enough, I got explanation number 4 in the mail. It took 1 year to get. Luckily, they didn't charge for it. They usually charge like $50. But it was the Roswell Report, The Truth in the New Mexican Desert. And that was explanation number 3, I think. Explanation number 4 was the Roswell Report, case closed. Now, this was released in '97, this new explanation. And it tried to tell us exactly what the Roswell incident was. Honestly, you know, we all know it was probably false, just like everything else was. But it was interesting to note that it was way too big for me to read because I was not going to read all about these test balloons and crash dummies. And, you know, I mean, that was just, to me, it was a waste of time. Historically, very valuable. I'm a huge history buff. Very valuable stuff. The only problem is, on the Roswell incident, I'm not going to waste my time trying to read their false stories. You know, this was an example of the newspapers that were going around. But luckily, and of course our explanation came from our friends at the Pentagon, but the Roswell Report, case closed, was accompanied by one other document, thank God, which was the executive summary. So it took a book this thick and made it this thick. So I was like, okay, well, I'll read that one. And I read that one. And really, you don't have to go far to figure out, okay, what is this report trying to say? And I'll go through the facts of what the Roswell incident, case closed, tried to say. There's only like 3 points here. Quote, aliens observed in the New Mexico desert were actually anthropomorphic test dummies that were carried aloft by U.S. Air Force high-altitude balloons for scientific research. The, quote, unusual military activities in the New Mexico desert were high-altitude research balloon launch and recovery operations. Reports of military units that always seemed to arrive shortly after the crash of a flying saucer to retrieve the saucer and, quote, crew were actually accurate descriptions of Air Force personnel engaged in anthropomorphic dummy recovery operations. Claims of, quote, alien bodies at the Roswell Army Airfield Hospital were most likely a combination of 2 separate incidents. A 1956 KC-97 aircraft accident in which 11 Air Force members lost their lives, and a 1959 manned balloon mishap in which 2 Air Force pilots were injured. And the last one that was my favorite. This report is based on thoroughly documented research supported by official records, technical reports, film footage, photographs, and interviews with individuals who were involved in these events. Now, I've known Stan Friedman for many, many years. He's talked to the people that were involved in these events. He's researched the documents. He's done more work than the U.S. Air Force probably ever has. And he's found a very different conclusion. Now, who did the Air Force talk to? That's a big question mark. What documents did they use? What official records? When I read through this, it's like you don't even realize, and I'll go back one slide, about the alien bodies. Look at the 2 incidents, 1956 and 1959. Do they really think that everybody in the nation that cares about the Roswell incident or what happened is that stupid? It happened in 1947, okay? I mean, that's a pretty big discrepancy if you ask me. Yet each and every witness, each and every newspaper article was wrong, that the dates were wrong. It happened with the test dummies. Those weren't used until '52. There's a little bit of a problem there. You know, and I thought it was kind of cool that one conspiracy led to time-traveling test dummies, which was really, you know, that's a big conspiracy that we could talk about. But there's, you know, I mean, we're dealing with stuff that happened years after this Roswell incident. So you have to ask your question yet again. Why does the U.S. Air Force try and think that we're that stupid? Because we're not. That's as far as I go into the Roswell incident. You know, just dealing with the Department of the Air Force alone, you deal with the Roswell incident, when you deal with their current manuals on reporting UFOs, when you deal with their fact sheet that they try and give you, conspiracy is made just with this agency alone. Yet that's one small piece to this puzzle. You deal with the NSA, the CIA, and that big list that I gave you in the beginning. This conspiracy is very real. What you might hear on the news broadcasts are, you know, and I heard this term the other day, and I didn't know anybody else used it because I always felt silly using it, but it's a giggle factor. You know, you always have that joke that's hidden in every media story. I've had the luck that when they've done interviews on my work and stuff, especially Fox did a really nice article or a nice interview on television. The newscasters sitting at the desk, sure enough, they have their little, you know, two-word joke at the very end. But the broadcasts are actually starting to latch onto the truth behind all of this. And I think with the U.S. Air Force alone, this can prove beyond any shadow of a doubt the UFO phenomenon is very real. And anybody that says otherwise probably hasn't even opened their eyes to just take a look. Now, I'll probably skim through this. I don't know how much time I have. I always look at both sides of what could be a UFO sighting that isn't necessarily the alien spacecraft that we want it to be. You got to ask your question, what is truly out there? Here's a couple pictures of, you know, what could possibly be misconstrued. Remote-controlled helicopter. I thought it was cool. They had 4 little landing pod things at the very bottom. I thought that was kind of neat. Remote-piloted research craft. This was a NASA-built research design. Flying wing. This was British, one of the first ones that they designed. The Navy Flounder, also called as the Flying Flapjack. The AVRO car, which we've all seen many, many times. And it's actually kind of funny, you read past reports, and I've had people say the same thing, that sightings through the 50s were this AVRO car that, you know, the government was trying to build. It was a joint Army and Air Force public, you know, project. And and I always laugh, and I have my own giggle factor because the AVRO car never got more than about 1.5 feet off the ground. So of course, you know, that pretty much dismisses that theory. I took it a couple steps farther. I started researching what other flying saucer designs were around, and I found what's called Project Silverbug. This is an example of the waiting game. I got the final report of Project Silverbug, or one of the reports, I should say, not necessarily the final. It's been years since I filed additional requests. I'm still waiting for WRIGHT-PATTERSON to give me more information. This was Project Silverbug. Flying saucer design, really cool. People speculated this was the AVRO car. That's not true. There's a big turbine fan, which you'll see in one of these documents. Reverse that. Silverbug sat in the middle. AVRO car sat in the front or something like that. But this obviously was not the same. AVRO car had little, there was many differences. So this was something completely different. I found a couple other project names of flying saucers that the government was trying to build. Here's a couple more views of it. Now, I don't know if this actually ever got off the ground. Sightings did a story about it, and they claim that they got pictures of it. Here's a couple pictures that Sightings claimed was Project Silverbug. I can't account that this is. On those drawings, you don't see the fins in the back. I wasn't too convinced, but I thought I'd throw them in there to make Sightings happy. So that's, as Sightings would call it, Project Silverbug. Now, I don't deal with just the UFO phenomenon. And sometimes to prove one conspiracy, you got to look at others. You got to look at the past. What have they covered up before? What have they hidden? What do they have the ability to hide? You got to look at a couple different factors to try and uncover this phenomenon. In the beginning, for about a year, I did only UFO stuff. Unfortunately, when I was waiting and waiting and waiting, I'm like, this is kind of boring. You know, I'm waiting for these documents. I wasn't doing anything. I started looking into other subject matter. And sure enough, I was starting to find all sorts of unbelievable stuff. I mean, I was looking at JFK assassination, remote viewing, nuclear weapons accidents, MK Ultra, Russian submarine Kursk, which is a very interesting story. And just, it kept going. All this stuff is on my website, by the way, if you it's blackvault.com. You can see the documents that are relating to these subjects. And there's 140,000 pages of reading, so obviously you might be there for a couple minutes. But this was proving to me they have the ability to hide this. That they're not only hiding the UFO phenomenon, but they're hiding a ton of stuff. And like I said, I've been a big history buff all my life. And I mean, I've researched World War II stories. I've researched top secret aircraft, historical aircraft. It's so cool to see the manuals, to see the original designs of some of these aircraft that maybe never even made it to the flight pad. But you see the technical drawings such as Project Silverbug. I don't know if that was ever flown or not, but it's very neat to see what what the government really has. I just recently went to the X conference in DC. I was able to, they have a great transit system there. I took the train system to the National Archives and then a cab to the actual building of where they keep all these documents. Now, to deal with photocopies for 7.5 years of these government documents, I'm telling you, I've never had the feeling of just being in awe of actually holding the actual documents. And when you go to the National Archives, they pull the documents. There's not a photocopy in those things. And I should have put the pictures in my presentation because I have them online. But you pull out these documents, the 1950s records from the Air Force or from the Army or from the Navy, and there's so much history behind this stuff. And you go through these boxes and you realize there's so much of everything. It's impossible for the government to say, oh, we did an exhaustive search. Yeah, right, they would do it for years if they did that. You have to rely based on their word. And going through these boxes taught me, wow, they must really have a hard time searching for some of my requests. And then I laughed, and then I said, well, I'm going to file a few hundred more. But it's so unbelievable to see that history and to hold that. And I just did a test. I pulled 24 boxes. And for hours I was there. I was there with a researcher by the name of Grant Cameron, if anybody knows Grant. And Grant and I have known each other for probably 4 years. We just had the greatest time. We were saying, I leaned over to Grant. It's pretty quiet. It's like a library when you get these documents. And I leaned over to Grant and I said, Grant, I'm pitching a tent. I'm moving in. Because it was unbelievable, the kind of history that you pull out of these boxes. Just on a side note, what I pulled out was the spies that we hired from foreign countries during World War II to go over to Germany and spy for us, secret agents to go over there, create a secret underground movements to try and overthrow Hitler in the 40s. And I mean, I was pulling out, and this is all original stuff, pictures of the actual secret agents back in the 40s that were declassified, most of which was all top secret, the actual project names, what their goal was. And then I got to one envelope, and you see these, really old, it was Office of Strategic Services, the old OSS envelope. And I opened the envelope, and I said, what's this? And out poured all of the passport material that the U.S. government created for the secret agents to falsify all the documentation. Now, everything was all Third Reich at the time. All the German passports, you see all the German stamps. I'm a huge World War II fanatic. So to see the actual, workbooks as well that these secret agents had in their back pocket. I mean, that's the most unbelievable feeling in the world. I've got awesome pictures, too, that you go online if you go to the image galleries. So anyway, that's my rant about all the history behind it. But there's so much, is my point. You touch on some of the conspiracies, and you don't realize exactly how much is truly out there. One of which is MK Ultra. And the thing with MK Ultra is there's way too much to really, that's a lecture in itself. But what I want to talk about is this is a prime example of the cover-up and the ability to hide whatever the U.S. government does. I'm surprised we found as much as we have on the UFO phenomenon. One story involved a doctor by the name of Dr. Frank Olson. And Dr. Frank Olson was a CIA scientist who was involved in the MK Ultra experiments. Now, without giving too much of the history behind MK Ultra, because like I said, that's a lecture in itself, there was a secret experiment that was done by Dr. Gottlieb is the actual, I forget his first name. Sidney, thank you. Did this experiment where he was able to obtain LSD, and they slipped it into glasses of Cointreau with about, I think, 10 scientists were in the room. None of the scientists knew that they were being tested on. And some of this mind control stuff was the combination of LSD, hypnosis. They were going to try and see that if the Soviets were able to obtain our scientists, how much information they can extract from them. What kind of intel would these guys spew out if they were under the combination of some of these drugs? And it was a falsified experiment. The director of the CIA at the time was Alan Dulles. His signature was falsified by a man by the name of Richard Helms. Helms falsified his signature. Gottlieb did the actual experiment. And everybody was later told that they were experimented on that night. One scientist did not drink alcohol, so he did not have the LSD. Everybody else was just noted as being loud and pretty much described a drunk kind of setting. So I'm reading the congressional transcripts, which I believe were 1977, when these hearings were on the MKUltra experiment, because all the documents were destroyed, surprisingly. Now, as the story progressed, I was reading this thing, and Dr. Frank Olson started having severe side effects, schizophrenia, paranoia. I mean, the guy was not doing too well. And they sent Dr. Olson with another agent who was Robert Lashbrook. And Lashbrook accompanied him to someplace in New York, which was a CIA-approved psychiatrist or psychologist, but I don't even think he actually had his license, if I remember reading that part correctly. Now, after days of therapy, they felt that Olson was getting better, and they felt that he was kind of recovering. It was around the time of Thanksgiving, so they let Dr. Olson go back to his family for Thanksgiving, and his family knew that there was something up, there was something wrong. They knew that there was a problem. So they went ahead and sent him back to this approved doctor to overlook Frank Olson. And a couple days go by, or however long it was, and Lashbrook and Olson were in the hotel room. I think they had a couple drinks that night. I'm surprised Olson even drank after his experiment. But I know that they had a couple glasses of wine at dinner, and they went to bed, and they felt that Olson was improving, and he was probably going to be going home the next day or two. What happened next was a little bit weird. You see the picture of the actual building that Dr. Frank Olson lunged himself out of the 8th or 10th story of that building to his death. He killed himself, suicide, or so they claim. The CIA then found out about his death, had to initiate a cover-up. Dr. Frank Olson was incredibly respected. He was a smart guy. He had no prior psychological problems at all. The CIA pretty much created a document to show that Dr. Olson was showing signs of this for weeks and months prior to the actual experiment, that the CIA had absolutely nothing to do with this, and that he killed himself out of his own depression and not because of a CIA experiment gone wrong. And they initiated a cover-up, and sure enough, that stuck around, and that's their current story to this day. I talked to Mr. Olson Jr. I talked to his son on the telephone, and he is still out there trying to get somebody to listen and try and get the CIA to fully admit what happened. Now remember I said that Dulles' signature was falsified by Richard Helms. Helms was later, he was later promoted to the director of the CIA himself. And sure enough, before he was out of office, he destroyed each and every one of the documents that was associated with this experiment because he was the one that actually falsified it. Now, you'd think that he would be booted or something like that for doing such a bad thing. He got a slap on the wrist and obviously was later promoted to the highest position in the CIA. So you're dealing with cover-ups all over the place. Some of you may have heard this. This has kind of been around there for a while. But when I talked to his son on the telephone, you realize that there's a bigger picture here. You know, that the government has the ability to cover this up, and it's very plausible that they are. Another one that I really got emotionally attached to was the Kursk. I'm just checking the time here. Okay, I've got about 5 minutes. The Kursk I got very attached to. This was the submarine that crashed, or that I shouldn't say crashed because that's the theory, that sunk a couple years ago. I had Freedom of Information Act requests sitting in the Department of the Navy and offices in the Pentagon while the poor 114 sailors, 115 sailors, were still alive on the bottom of the sea. And the Pentagon had requests because I knew that something bad was going on. I knew that the Russian government that was saying that they collided with a U.S. submarine, that probably was true. So as I started researching this and the guys died, the tapping stopped. They were dead at the bottom of the sea. My requests were coming back. On the press reported that the U.S. government had no submarines in the area. What they tried to say was that the Russian government said we collided with the U.S. The U.S. and Soviet, or the Russian submarine collided. the U.S. said, well, no, that's not true because we didn't have any submarines in the area. We played no role in this. This was something that the Russians made a mistake with and they killed their own sailors. Hey, don't look at us. Here's the problem. We had not one, not two, but actually 3 submarines in the area, one of which was on a top secret mission. The other 2 was for unknown reasons. They were all in the same area that the Kursk went down. A U.S. submarine docked in a Norwegian port on an emergency basis the night the Kursk went down because it was crippled. Why? When they got to the front of the Kursk submarine, there was a large hole and dent in the front of the hole with scrapes along the entire side of it. Why? If it was just a explosion from the torpedo like they claimed, there wouldn't be scrapes, the divers wouldn't have seen anything like that, and so on. So the government is initiating yet another cover-up. Why? Because there's 115 reasons to do so. So I got extremely emotionally attached to this. I don't know why. I have in my house, I have every Russian medal that they gave to the family members of the Kursk, to the ones that they gave to the Kursk sailors themselves. I have the pennant flag that was flown on the day the Kursk was launched, and I have the pennant flag that was flown the day the Kursk went down. And it's really, you know, I don't know why. Don't ask, I really don't know why I got so attached to this. But this is yet another example of a cover-up. And there's so many of these that I could tell you stories for absolute hours, but Richard Dolan, my dear friend, would get really upset because I'm going into his time right now. Real quick, you will find me in the back. I'll be in the back corner. I know Richard Dolan is up next. Make sure you definitely stay around for that. The Black Vault television series, which is something I've been working on for many, many years. We're making advancements on it. It's a very slow process. It's very hard to get the government's closely guarded secrets on television as a big surprise. But we are making some headway. We signed a nice contract last December, so make sure you look out for that. And that's it. I appreciate all your time. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, John. We have a break for about 10 minutes until 10 o'clock.